Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's NeoSystems CMMC Town Hall. Now I'd like to introduce your host, Ed Bassett from NeoSystems. Ed?
Thanks, Don. Hi, welcome everybody to our continuing series of Town Hall Ask Me Anything sessions on cybersecurity maturity model certification. Our guest today is Chris Nissen of MITRE. I just want to let everybody know we are recording these sessions as part of our community outreach to the defense industrial base. Our focus as a managed service provider is mostly on organizations seeking certification. That's primarily who's in our audience today. If you're in the audience, please do submit your questions for Chris to answer. We'll be looking at those questions throughout and trying to weave in as many questions as we can get to as time permits. I'll start with the introduction of Chris Nissen. Chris is the Director of Asymmetric Threat Response and Supply Chain Security within the Special Concepts Group at the MITRE Corporation. He's been with MITRE since the mid-90s, working on big data analytics, some intelligence projects I suppose he probably can't tell us about, critical infrastructure protection. Lately, he's been looking very hard at how our adversaries might exploit our supply chains and how we can do a better job of defending against those attacks. Really relevant to CMMC is that Chris is the co-author of the Deliver Uncompromised report from MITRE that was published in 2018. And that report really plays a very central role in the origin story of CMMC. Most of the concepts of CMMC came directly from recommendations within that report. So very excited to have Chris here kind of tell us firsthand some of that background and how it applies to what we're doing today. So as we've kind of explored on this series, the evolution of CMMC as it's evolved and become reality for all of us, we tend to get pretty wrapped up in the details of the requirements. There's a lot of nuts and bolts and they're changing day by day, but it's good once in a while, certainly today we're going to do this, it's good to step back and understand the why. Why is this needed? Why are we doing this? Why is the DoD mandating this across the entire defense industrial base, all companies? What problems is CMMC attempting to solve, and why is it the right solution to those problems? So with that, I'm going to dive into some questions for Chris. So Chris, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So the subtitle of the Deliver Uncompromised report is a strategy for supply chain security and resilience in response to the changing character of war. A little bit of a mouthful. Can you tell us a little bit about how the character of war has changed and how we should be responding to that change? And I'm suspecting this has something to do with the word asymmetric that's in your job title. Am I right?
Exactly. Yeah, and the strategy comes from a threat response in my title, because I used to have just asymmetric threat, and all it was, that was 4 or 5 years ago when I first began to recognize some of these concepts, and all it did was scare people to say, oh my gosh, you've got the compelling evidence that bad things are happening and going to happen. And it became obvious that what we needed was a strategy, what we needed was a response. And you're exactly right, Ed. It is that asymmetric piece. And the reason I use that language is because our adversaries do. And when I say adversaries, I primarily mean nation-state entities. Obviously, China and Russia are the two that people think about the most, but North Korea, Iran, others, they all have different strategies and tempos and timelines and end states for what they want to accomplish. And there's been an awful lot of recognition recently on Russia, and then even more so, I think, on China. And there's no response for that, right? So I consider this a new era, and China and Russia actually used the words. They literally said in the late 80s, early 90s, that we don't want to take on the United States kinetically. We would prefer to take them on asymmetrically. One of them said anti-symmetrically. And by that, they mean, okay, if we're fighting, if we're preparing for our traditional conventional power offset with kinetic weapons and weapon systems and information systems, asymmetrically is a concept of undercutting those. So put a little bit of effort in, they get a big return on investment out. And that has fundamentally changed the character of war. When I had the report in draft, General Mattis had been interviewed, Secretary Mattis at the time had been interviewed, and he was at the time saying, for my entire career, I did not believe that the character of war ever changed. And now I'm kind of rethinking that. And I had had a few discussions with a couple stat flag officers at the Pentagon, and one of them said after reading the draft, you know, you're the first one kind of putting your finger on why the character of war is changing. And a classic example of that I think you can give is, you know, I'll just make something up, right? What if when we were bombing Syria a few years back, and Russia was occupying Syria, and instead of responding to us kinetically by launching fighters or missiles or whatever in the theater, their response was asymmetric and misattributed in our critical infrastructure. So, you know, natural gas stations blowing up, you know, pumping stations, compression stations, electric utilities going down. You know, the backbone of critical infrastructure is the ability to move money, information, and energy. And those are targeted in the open source. You can read about that. The point was, the concept that I was having in that discussion with the officers were, you've stopped, if not reversed, the president's ability to command, because there's no one in the cabinet to turn to and say, what's happening? Are these things correlated? Are they uncorrelated? That is a fundamental change in the character of war when the leadership from the president down they do not have the information to make a decision. And that is the single greatest problem with cyber threats and supply chain threats. It's very almost easy to make it look like it came from over there. But in reality, this entity did it. That's a fundamental change to the character of war, and it's something that we're only on the first steps of building a defense for. And you can't win by only defending your goal in the long run.
So defense is certainly a piece of what we're doing under CMMC, right? Cyber hygiene is the word that they use. How does that changing character of war lead us to better hygiene, or the need for cyber hygiene? Why is that a critical part of the sort of collective response that we put together?
Well, because defense is absolutely necessary. You also can't win if your goalie isn't there, and the other team is just scoring on you, even if you score a couple good hits. I'll drop off that analogy a little bit because it could go in some really interesting places. We just don't have time at half an hour. But I think the reason there's such a focus on cyber is that historically it has been the easiest. And by that I mean, I think it's a footnote in the report. When I define supply chain security, I define it as major attack vectors that in counterintelligence are considered blended operations. And the adversary moves in and out of these vectors as a function of opportunity, strategic intent, a whole bunch of things. Those include cyber IT, humans, witting or unwitting, formal supply chain, software, hardware, services, products, whatever, and then cyber OT or ICS systems. Historically, 90% probably, it's easiest to launch those from the cyber domain, in the cyber domain. So probably 99% of the world's energy in the corporate world has been at least try to do due diligence in cyber IT. And it's incredibly frustrating that our adversaries and even individuals can attack us from the other side of the world with a keyboard. So viewing supply chain security writ large through the cyber realm makes a lot of sense. In the long run, we can't be ignoring these other realms, and that's why I spent so much time with them in the report. So I think cyber hygiene is fundamental and is really the foundation. Something what I hope we get to talk a little bit about in this half hour is it's also the primary vector to what I consider the next great wave of what CMMC and others are going to have to address. And that is the software that's sitting inside the enterprises and inside the products that are delivered. So there you get into section 889, part A and part B, which we had a discussion on a panel session a while ago. You know, simply put, there's two supply chains in this realm. There's a supply chain concern on your enterprise, and there's a supply chain, that's part B, and there's a supply chain concern on the products that you deliver to your customers. And open source software has seen a 460% resurgent in what we call next generation cyber attacks. So even if you're doing a great job and you're changing your passwords, you know, that's necessary you need to lock down your cyber IT because they're trying to come in. But remember, this is a dynamic adversary, and they're like, okay, if you're going to do that, I wonder if your software programmers are really thinking about the heritage and knowing where all those dependencies come in the software that you're pulling in, either to your enterprise or to the products that you're delivering. And I think that's going to be the next bow wave that we're going to see.
You mentioned the dynamic adversary, and CMMC tries to sort of allocate dollars where they're going to do the most good, with levels 4 and 5 having a pretty dynamic nature, the lower levels being somewhat static, I would say, and the idea being that, you know, maybe those companies are lesser targets, and don't have quite as sophisticated an adversary to deal with. So the concept of levels is about allocation of dollars at the end of the day. Interesting though, in CMMC, that's based on the kind of information you store and process. It doesn't take into consideration company size, industry, reputation, previous targeting. It doesn't take into effect any of those factors, just the kind of data. So in that sense, all companies are treated equal. How does that jibe with your understanding of threat selection criteria? In other words, when the threat is choosing who to attack and where to attack, those threat actors, are we lining our expenditure up in a way that is going to be effective against those targeting strategies?
Well, yes and no. In the long run, you know, the way I've often referred to CMMC is necessary but not sufficient. The yes is it's necessary, and when Katie first rolled it out, Katie Arrington, you know, she explained the levels as, you know, why do we give away the base blueprints to the landscapers, just so that they could know where every pipe fitting is and, you know, electrical outlet out in the yard and everything. You know, that should have to be controlled to some level. So from that standpoint, yes, necessary but not sufficient. She's trying to throw a blanket over everything and say, look, to do business with us, you have to go through this. And we see that the enemy is attacking us from all over. In reality, and you know, I've worked with people that have spent decades doing offensive supply chain attacks. The team I have has that expertise. And one of the frustrating things when I take that individual around and they give talks is they'll talk about all of these esoteric things that we'll do. And my argument is it just scares people, because the reality is the adversary is not going to go through more effort than they have to. I mean, why do it? That's not to, so, you know, are they really going to come in through the landscaper? Probably not. It just depends how hard the target is they're going after. No, to the you know, to counter what I just said, or to augment it, I guess, Ed, is, you know, look at the J35. There was a breach against its software systems from a small software development company in Australia. Now, why did the adversary know that that company was even in the supply chain and involved? You know, that's a whole other dimension I give in my talks, that I think there's a lot the government needs to do beyond pointing at the DIB, and part of that requires definitely new policy, probably new legislation. And by that I mean, you know, this is asymmetric because the adversaries understand PII protections, personal protections, legal authorities, and that U.S. persons protections, and they snuggle right up and they understand exactly how to utilize that. We have great transparency laws in the I shouldn't say great, we have many transparency laws that require, you know, kind of full disclosure on everything that you're doing in government. Well, the adversaries mind that. And there has been some talk about, you know, removing that from the public eye, yet still making it available to, you know, GAO and OMB and other entities that need to do audits. But it's startlingly easy for an adversary to discover, to do that target selection. MITRE has something called the attack model, and it talks about, you know, tradecraft that we've had in the counterintelligence for decades, the steps you go through to choose who you're going to attack, and then once you launch that attack, how are you going to maintain command and control, execute the attack, and then unwind it. The problem with it is, you know, if we're trying to counter a nation-state adversary, all of them are closed government systems by and large, and we have to start at square one. We basically give them a third to, you know, 40% of that attack model. We hand it to them. find it on the internet. Oh, here's this little company in Australia. Oh, look, it's only got 7 employees. Oh, look, they're writing software that goes into the helmet system. I think I'll go target them. And that's a real challenge. So I think what you're starting to see, we talk about risk as a function of threat, vulnerability, and consequence. That's in Deliver and Compromise. Fundamentally important. I don't expect a small company like that to probably be doing that. But where we do have to get is everybody recognize I'm somewhere on a threat matrix that the adversary has. And if you're working on a classified program, or you're supporting what you understand as a national capability, whether it's a missile system, whether it's a ship, your awareness should probably rise a little bit. I think of the prime contractors, it definitely is. The primes are starting to understand, okay, and that's why we named the report what we did. It was really a challenge to the department to show me a single program that hasn't been compromised by the time it's put into delivery. Deliver it uncompromised is a vision. It's not meant to be a provocative statement. It's saying this is unacceptable. And to fix that, it's got to go way beyond government, which is why I'm spending so much of my time in the private sector. As I said in the last panel session, I'm working on a risk monetization model. The C-suites and companies have to understand what their targets, and they have to understand that, they do understand that every dollar is limited. The money that they spend on things like CMMC and supply chain security and insider threat, all of those elements, has to have some kind of payback. So we have to start talking to them in terms of monetizing that investment. Whereas on the government side, there isn't a whole lot of monetization of the taxpayers' dollars other than I better spend what was allocated to me, because if I don't, I'm not going to get as much next year. That's totally different, which is why putting security in as a fourth pillar was so important to us. I think they kind of danced around that a little bit with CMMC. I see elements in the DIB and the private sector, in the DIB and outside the DIB, that definitely are not. In other words, they are starting to make decisions based on purchasing decisions based on what kind of risk, if I make this purchase, am I bringing into my enterprise, and how can I mitigate that risk? The companies that are doing that are going to be out ahead of everyone else in the long run.
Well, you mentioned, blanket approach trying to cover everybody. I mean, the landscaper is really a target. I don't, you said maybe not, but look at Target retail store. The attack there came in through the HVAC contractor. Look at NotPetya. There was a Russian attack on some relatively obscure Ukrainian accounting software that had, potentially unintentional, but the most monetary damage of any attack at that time. So, these seemingly small, not terribly significant chunks of things have been successfully targeted to great effect, way beyond what you think that initial target looks like. So one of the key themes of the Deliver and Compromise that I quote pretty often in some of my presentations is this concept of giving contractors a profit motive to enhance security. So you were kind of coming into that in the last piece of your commentary there, the idea of changing security from an expense to a competitive advantage. And in CMMC, we're seeing, the crowds that we're talking to now are sort of selection bias towards the early adopter crowd, right? These are the people that are interested in CMMC, not the people who think it's terrible and they're never going to have to do it. So there's some of that going on, that we're talking to the people who are most enthusiastic. And I think the audience here today probably fits that demographic. The security community has been talking about this notion of, make security a competitive advantage for a long time. But for most companies, that's really has not been, until now, the fiscal reality. You talked about the fourth pillar and adding that to the traditional cost, schedule, and performance factors. How does that move get security out of the sort of necessary cost column and into something that people view in a positive way, both in terms of financial incentive and in terms of how they perceive it, how they view the money they're spending on cyber?
Right. That's a great question. We held a series of roundtables with tier 1 contractors and some tier 2s and some representative of tier 3s at MITRE. And there was a big push there on legislative changes, and that was from everything from tax credits to DFARS, and information sharing. Ideally, the underlying structure of Deliver Uncompromised is technology, policy, and legislation, because any department or head or executive can make technology and policy decisions. But we need to change some laws if you want to go down those routes. I do say large scale. In the 2 years since that report, there's absolutely no question that we're turning that corner and we're starting to head in that direction. And I've said it many times before, so my apologies if your audience has heard this, but I do say that 15, 20 years ago, you can run a company and not do cyber due diligence. You can't today. You can run a company and be pretty much ignoring your supply chain. You're not going to be able to in the next few years. Your investors, your creditors, and most importantly, the companies that you'll be providing to won't accept it. And the companies that I know of, and even a foreign government that have reorganized elements along Deliver Uncompromised, their CEOs see that. They see that there's value, and that's what I'm trying to work into this risk monetization score. Part of that is, what is your brand worth? What does it mean if you've been breached 4 times and it's your fault and your company is at the top of the headline that caused this thing to happen? Hard to say. One of the CISOs of one of the tier 1s who I know very well said, their stock price is tied towards stability because the vast majority of their shareholders are pension funds that don't like volatility. So they're very attuned to that. To them, brand directly translates into maintaining our stock price stability. But an interesting thing has happened across government, with how the government is acting. And there's an interesting article that came out on the 26th talking about this decoupling of China and supply chains. And, I really like the way they said it here. U.S. companies increasingly need to choose between U.S. government sales and reliance on Chinese supply chains. Across federal government, not just the executive branch, but across federal government, and not just in the DIB, a line is kind of being drawn. And, that's everything from, this concept of adding security into the contract decision, which some of the services are doing. The Section 881 of the NDAA, the 806 authorities, the 889B banning certain companies, covered companies by name, and others like it, as well as CFIUS and FIRMA, and this push for onshoring just for COVID. There's been a tremendous number of incentives for large manufacturing firms to pull back. AFWorks had a major competition out to give millions of dollars of incentives to take your overseas Chinese production and bring it back home, and then win a big contract to provide that to the government. So, and there's others, right? Security requirements out of other elements of the NDA, export controls. So there's a whole set of things just within the DIB that is sending the message, if you want to do business with us, it's going beyond CMMC. That's what you need to do for the Pentagon, but at a federal level. And then the other big thing is yesterday, for those of your listeners that don't know, the interim rule for the Federal Acquisition Supply Chain Security Act came out, and it's open for comments. And that's really interesting. The Federal Acquisition Security Council, the FASC, is interagency. I know several people on it from various agencies. They have tremendous authority. And they're stepping into in what they call Section 202, which I think in their United States Code, Section 201, they're stepping into setting up an information sharing task force with DHS as a head, and they're walking through even down, taking that task force and then information sharing, threat realization, and then down to removal orders. Remember, this whole thing started with Binding Operational Directive 17-1, which is DHS telling all federal agencies, get Kaspersky, put together a plan, identify what Kaspersky is in your enterprise, identify a plan to get rid of it, report out every 120 days to get rid of it. It was the Pentagon that wasn't doing anything about it because they didn't fall under that authority. And that's when I got pulled in and said, what should we be doing? I think you're going to see that. And what this interim rule is basically saying, expect more of this in supply chain. So it's so broad cutting and going beyond just the DoD, although the DoD still spends, almost $1 trillion every palm cycle. If you look at all of those dimensions, I think that sentence is really true. You're going to have to start choosing, do I want to do business with China and move away from the US government, or do I not? And I think, that coupled with the private sector, even at the citizen level, the impression that they're getting of China being in our supply chain, I think that's another pivot point that's coming in behind this for a private sector company to say, well, okay, I'm recommending labeling laws. It's pretty disappointing when you as an individual say, I don't want to buy anything with Chinese electronics in it. That's a whole piece. Obviously, you can't ignore components necessarily. But then, you try to do all your research and it comes in and there's a sticker, and then right underneath it on the bottom in little letters, made in China. It's like that level of awareness in the private sector is going to be a third buttress point. So I think we're getting there. A lot's happened in the last 24 months.
This audience question came in about Ripple 20 supply chain threat, and what that news, how that should fit into what we think and do about CMMC as we move forward. Is that tie into some of that you were just talking about?
Yeah, I think with that one, it's kind of two things. One, it's maybe they're all in one. It's showing that there's anytime you centralize assets or capability, it's an MO that both China and Russia love. Again, a little bit of effort, whole lot of payback. That's why open source is such a huge target for them now. Maybe we can go over that in more detail in another talk. But supply chains include systemic risk. And the only real way to attack that is through strategic warning and information sharing. So I would argue that right now, there's not a whole lot of defense we have. We've got more defense in the open source world than we do in the open source software world, than we do writ large across entities that are, deliberately trying to attack a supply chain. However, the FASC is looking at prototyping elements in the National Supply Chain Intelligence Center, modeled after NCTC, to kind of have systemically bring all the authorities of government down with information sharing with the private sector and start to give strategic warning. It's criminal when we see something, and the adversaries are responding, right? They're starting to see, wow, I can inject an exploit before there's a CVE on it. Whereas before, it's, we sat back in the private sector, I got a CVE, now I got to get it patched. And 10 years ago, you had a week. Today, you have like less than an hour. But now they're injecting new exploits that they're developing because they know that we're kind of not watching that. So there's a lot more to Ripple 20. We can talk about that more in the future too. But it's interesting how much supply chain gave it its power and kind of blew it up.
So Chris, we're getting close to the end of our time, and so I want to kind of round this back to CMMC a little bit. I mean, looking at the alignment between CMMC and the recommendations in the Deliver Uncompromised report, the similarity is striking, right? There's a lot of things that you specifically recommended: independent assessments, not-for-profit body essentially administering this, some different levels of resilience, and a whole lot more. So I think first you must be pretty proud to see those recommendations taking on such a concrete life in a relatively short period of time in the scheme of government policy making. So I think you've had probably a more early influence on CMMC than most, but now as you see it unfolding and see it, again, taking on a life of its own, I'm sure you've seen it go places that you didn't foresee, and maybe some good, some bad. The team that's developing it, they're putting a lot of energy into making it good, making it workable. They're doing a lot of listening. So I kind of want to throw open to you as you look on it now and see how it's evolving versus what you might have had in mind originally. what's kind of your number one advice to the folks that are rolling out CMMC as they move from a standard to practice and try to take this to the DIB? Something that you would either encourage or redirect of what's going on?
I'm really going to answer that by saying two things, but they're kind of related because I think it's that important. And I completely agree with the comment about a lot of listening. I think everything I hear from everyone I talk to backs up everything going. There is a dialogue, which is refreshing,
very much,
considering how hard this is to do. The two things to me would be, I would go back to, this is bigger than cyber. And as I've already said earlier in this talk, we got to start looking at the software supply chain. So one way of thinking about that is don't feel constrained by 889 A and B, but kind of think about that. Think about how could CMMC 2.0 be looking at better positioning that does it really matter the difference between the enterprise and the product that's actually being delivered, because the enterprise is just as important. It may just be the launch vector to the real attack they're going to run. So open source software is a huge threat. The statistics on it are scary. I mean, I'm looking at 1.5 trillion downloads expected in 2020. We're well on our way there. And the amount of dependencies, and again, they're going after the most important things, NPM being one of them. So again, when everything's centralized, let me get an exploit in there, and boom, you've pulled it into your enterprise, you've pulled it into your product, and you have no idea about it. There's not a CVE out there. So software bill of materials and really getting after the software that is part of this whole cyber environment, I think is probably the one thing. The other thing, and it's a little bit secondary, but it's important for a lot of companies, and that is, you and I, Ed, have talked about this a little bit, but I view the world as, okay, there's, a spectrum. You got the United States government, very good in what we're trying to do. Then you got your Five Eye partners. Okay, very good. Special relationship, we share stuff with them. And then the other end, there's bad. This is bad. These people want to hurt us. And that's all we really talk about. And I look at the spectrum along that line as being gray, to say, well, what about those companies that are strong countries, that are strong allies? And, even if you just limit yourself to Five Eyes, it's really not clear. BAE is a British company that is split in between the United States and Britain. And there's a lot of information sharing. There's a lot of foreign companies that are on that spectrum, that are good companies, that it's not clear how CMMC is going to work with them. That's important. Might have been an oversight. I don't know. Might be secondary. I don't know. But that needs to be addressed. We can't, if we're compromised, they're compromised. If they're compromised, we're compromised. So we need to address, in my humble view, those two things are really, up next. And all with the underscore of nothing should ever be static. I haven't heard how often, audits are going to have to be done, or recertifications are going to have to be done. Are they going to be based on a trigger event? Software as a, part A, part B, straddling that with open source, foreign entities, and, especially at that good end and how they interact. And then not treating it as a static problem would be my rank order.
Good advice, Chris, for sure. And I mean, Katie, especially Katie Arrington, has made a point of saying that CMMC is not a checklist. So it's designed to have us all be thinking a little bit broader than just complying. And it's always a risk, right, that you just end up putting your head down and checking the boxes. But there's a notion that we should be looking at things more broadly. Some of those, certainly the software topic is certainly not at all fully addressed by CMMC, and so hopefully teed up. So thanks very much. As these sessions are the best when it leaves everybody wanting a little bit more. And I know I, in particular, want quite a bit more of this conversation. There's a whole lot of topics we could get to, but we are at the end of our time. So I want to thank you, Chris, for joining us today. I want to thank our audience members. I hope that this was informative and exciting, and some things to think about, maybe again, outside of the sort of nuts and bolts discussion of CMMC, about why we're doing it, why it's important, and why it's going to have a positive effect on national security. I do want to remind the audience that we are going to take a break next week for the Labor Day holiday. So we're not going to have a town hall next week, but we will be restarting on September 16th, Wednesday, September 16th at 1 p.m. Eastern. I also would like to put in a quick plug for an event that we are having on the 14th of September. Katie Arrington and myself will be having a fireside chat, diving deep into CMMC and really looking at what's going on, what's new and exciting from Katie's perspective in terms of driving this to reality. That's going to be on the 14th of September at 4 p.m. You can register at cybersecuritytv.net. So that's www.cybersecuritytv.net. So please go there and register if you're interested in that session. Should be very exciting. And thanks very much, Chris. Thanks, audience. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Have a great Labor Day.